to see you, especially our dear guest from the States, Barry Smith. You gave your lecture yesterday. Now I'm really happy that you are giving today a lecture as a part of our faculty days, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. So I'm so grateful to you and to the Center for Advanced Studies Southeast Europe and our philosophy department that you are becoming part of our program, main program, and I'm especially welcoming you for this occasion. One personal note before you kick off with your talk. I'm kind of fan of your ontology in biological sciences, so I follow quite closely your work in that field. I'm doing philosophy biology, but we have some scholars in our PhD program doing ontology in biological sciences and biomedical sciences. So in that case, I'm so glad that we will be able in the future to connect and expand our research in biological biomedical ontology with you. So please welcome our dear guest, and you can start with your lecture. And I'm going to stay here for half an hour, and then I must be. So in advance, I'm apologizing for my leading.
So you'll miss the biomedical bits.
At least I get my biological.
You know what that's about.
That's right.
Sorry for missing that part. So please welcome our dear guest.
So I thought it would be useful to start with some autobiographical remarks. So the first few slides I'm going to try and make some sense of what I've been doing for what seems like a long, long time. So originally I studied mathematics and philosophy, and my principal person who I paid attention to in Oxford was Michael Dummett, who is, as many of you will know, an expert on Frege. And I wrote my PhD on Frege, but also on Husserl, and also, in fact, on Dummett. I decided I didn't like Frege, because Frege, it seemed to me, did ontology, which I was already interested in a way which made ontology seem a bit like the study of astrology. So he was a Platonist. He was staring into the skies and inventing an ontology to match his Platonistic conceptions. He wasn't really interested in the real world of what happens when this is the case. So I thought that Husserl might be an alternative. And so I tried to set Frege and Husserl off against each other. Dummett, however, by inspiring me with an interest in Frege, inspired me with an interest in the German-speaking world of philosophy. Husserl then inspired me with a narrower interest in the Austrian world of philosophy, since, of course, Husserl was born in Austria, or in what is now called Bohemia, or, I guess, the Czech Republic. And Ingarden, Roman Ingarden, who was a philosopher working in Krakow, which was then part of Austria, but which is now, so they tell me, part of Poland. And Wittgenstein, who spent most of his adult life in Cambridge, but was also an Austrian philosopher. In 1982, I edited a thick volume on formal ontology, but it was a volume about ideas on formal ontology, especially inspired by the Austrian philosophers. And this volume was put together in close collaboration with Kevin Mulligan and Peter Simons, who are also two philosophers very interested in the Austrian tradition. And we together published a paper in 1984 called Truth Makers, in which we defended the view that if you want to understand the semantics of language, then you need to see how language relates to the bits and pieces of reality. For instance, bits and pieces of diseases, or of weather, or of people shooting each other. So, in other words, really real bits and pieces of reality, not set theoretic entities, and certainly not Platonic entities, but everyday events and qualities and so forth. At the same time, I was working on the history of Gestalt theory, which also has an Austrian wing to it. I put together the papers that I've been writing on Austrian philosophy over the years in this volume on Austrian philosophy, which you can download from the web for free if you're interested in Austrian philosophy. And I take it that the key to Austrian philosophy is Franz Brentano. So Brentano was the person who taught Husserl, who taught Ingarden, and so on. That's actually what the first part of my talk is about. This is just the preamble to the first part of my talk. And the key to Brentano's idea is that philosophy and science are, methodologically speaking, the same. So to do philosophy properly, you should be doing science. In Germany, on the other hand, there is an iron wall between philosophy and science. So the Germans don't like the idea that philosophy might have anything to do with science. I'm simplifying a little bit. There are 2 or 3 Germans who don't treat philosophy as being separated by this iron wall. But in Austria, philosophy and science were very closely intermingled with each other. So this is the Vienna Circle. Ernst Mach is another tradition which is only loosely related to the Brentano tradition, but Michael Dummett actually wrote a book on the origins of analytic philosophy in which he makes the case that the origins of analytic philosophy are in Central Europe and that they are products of these 2 strands meeting. And the Vienna Circle Unified Science Movement is another instance of this Austrian merging of philosophy and science. The Unified Science Movement thought that the goal of philosophy should be to help to create a unified science effectively through logic. You translate all sciences into logic, and because the logic is common, the sciences will be integrated together. Now, in around about 1995, I discovered that there were in Italy, strangely enough, in Trento or in Padova, a group of people who were doing something that they called ontological engineering. And basically they were trying to translate scientific propositions into computational artifacts, which they call ontologies. And I spent some time in Padova working with these people, and I became interested in the idea that philosophical ontology could contribute to the way in which computers were treating scientific research. So, as you all, I hope, know, all scientific disciplines in the future will be computational disciplines. You can't do science today without computers because the data is too big. So human beings can't understand the data without the aid of computers. So philosophy will be part of computer science in the future, as soon as we start doing philosophy seriously. I also became interested specifically in issues of computational geo-ontology, the ontology of geopolitics. And one of the products of this interest was a paper I wrote on war, which it's located at this website, which ends with bosnia.html. So anyone who is interested in Bosnia might want to look at that paper. And then I published with Achille Bazzi and Roberto Casati in a volume edited by Nicola Guarino, who was the ontological engineer who founded the Institute in Padova, a paper on ontological tools for geographic representation in a volume, in a series on frontiers in artificial intelligence and its applications. So gradually you can see a certain shift away from East Central Europe and towards the computer. Then I started working on biomedicine, and I published this paper with a student of mine on what I call embryontology, which is the dual discipline of gerontology. Gerontology is about death, embryology is about birth. And this led me to be interested in the question, how can we categorize reality? For instance, the reality of all that is going on in human development from embryo to fetus to child. How can we categorize all of those things in such a way that we can represent scientific data about those things? So this is a philosophical question which has its roots in Aristotle's categories, but it's a philosophical question which has an implication for the way we treat scientific data computationally. Now, at about this time, I was awarded a large amount of money by the German government, with a kind of miracle. I got a fax from Germany which said, we are going to give you 4 million Deutschmarks. The condition was that I had to spend it on science in Germany. So I founded this institute and started working seriously on the ontology of medicine. And that was the start, from my point of view, of what I think of as the realist ontology movement, which is a descendant of the Vienna Circle Unified Science movement. So the idea is that scientific theories are not collections of propositions, they're not logical artifacts, they are computational artifacts. And the problem of the unity of science is not a logical problem, it's a problem of consistent categorization. It's an empirical problem, belonging to a new empirical science, which is the science of ontology. So ontology is no longer a part of philosophy, it's becoming an independent discipline. And if you look at ontology in Google, you will see that most of the entries at the beginning, the entries which are really important, are not philosophical entries, they're entries having to do with computers and science. And if you go to Google and you search for biomedical ontology, you will see that there is a very living and thriving industry of people working in biomedical ontology, including, I'm happy to hear, in Rijeka. So, new science. Physics used to be part of philosophy, economics used to be part of philosophy, psychology used to be part of philosophy, and even computer science has its roots in the work of people like Turing, who were philosophers. So philosophy is the mother of the sciences, and sometimes the child has to escape the house where it was born and become an adult. That's the end of the preamble. Now comes the talk. So, ontology is born, and to understand what that involves, we should look at other examples of the birth of sciences, and the most obvious example is psychology. So psychology was established in 1879 by Wilhelm Wundt, who was a professor of philosophy. And in fact, the journal which Wundt founded to publish the results of his experiments in psychology was called Philosophische Studien. So Wundt founds his laboratory, but in fact the German part of this process was only one part. It was a German-speaking issue, so there were no psychologists in America. There were no psychologists in England at this time. Psychology was a German-speaking enterprise. The founders of psychology in America came to the German-speaking world to do their PhDs. So in those days, the German-speaking world was where the action was, psychologically speaking. But there was an Austrian contribution, and the history of Austrian philosophy is also the history of Austrian psychology. So the first laboratory of experimental psychology in Austria-Hungary was founded in Graz in 1897 by Meinong. And Ehrenfels, who was a student of Meinong's, founded the Gestalt psychology movement. He coined the term Gestalt as a term of psychology. And Twardowski founded the first laboratory of experimental psychology in Galicia. I shouldn't say Poland there, because of course it wasn't in Poland at that time. It was in Austria. So, actually it wasn't even in Poland, it was in the Ukraine. It was in Lvov, or Lemberg, or Lviv. Meinong was born in Lvov, but he spent most of his career in Graz. Ehrenfels spent most of his career in Prague. Husserl was born in Prosnitz, but spent most of his career in Germany. And then Twardowski was born in Vienna, but spent most of his career in Lvov. So you can see that we're talking about a country where people used to move around. Some of them would leave and go to Germany. Now there is a southern wing of all of this. Meinong had various students from nearby places. Meinong in Graz had, for instance, Franz Weber and Michailo Rostohan, is that how you say it? And he had Vittorio Bellusi, who was a very interesting Italian psychologist who created the Gestalt movement in psychology. And the Austrians didn't only contribute to philosophy in the general sense and to psychology, but they also made important contributions to ontology. The first use of the term formal ontology was by Husserl in his logical investigations. Husserl thought that there was, on the one hand, formal ontology, which deals with general categories like thing, property, state of affairs, unity, plurality, and so forth. And then there were domain ontologies, which deal with specific domains, such as the psyche, or the living, or the political, and so forth. Now that distinction between formal ontology and domain ontologies is very important for contemporary biomedical ontology. Now, Brentano was interested in intentionality, or aboutness. Wundt was interested in sensation, stimulus. So Wundt's experimental psychology was very much a psychology of sensation. And Wundt thought that studying other kinds of experience belonged to what he called Völkerpsychologie, the psychology of peoples. He wrote 96 books, I think, most of which very rarely been even opened. But his main contribution was to the psychology of sensation. Brentano's main contribution was to the psychology of aboutness, directedness. So we are all now thinking about Brentano. Our mental experiences are about Brentano. They are intentionally directed towards Brentano. Now this is a kind of magic. How is it possible that here, in 2014, we can all be thinking about a dead person who no longer exists, about whom many of us have never previously heard? Well, actually, that's probably unfair. We've all heard a little bit about Brentano, but we're all now thinking about Brentano. It's a miracle. But that miracle is, according to Brentano, what is characteristic of psychology, of the mind. That's what makes the mind different from anything physical, according to Brentano. This magical power of intentional directedness. Now, all of the people listed here and many other of their students were all obsessed with this problem of intentionality. How is it possible that we can be intentionally directed, particularly towards, for instance, what does not exist? Brentano does not exist. did exist. This is the problem of intentionality. And the idea is that we succeed in being directed towards objects because of something which we might call content, sometimes called meaning. Now, one case of content is sensory content. So we see this bottle of water and we have a sensory experience. If I throw the bottle of water, then we have an even more urgent sensory experience which forces us to react. This kind of sensory experience is evolutionarily very basic. So even small organisms, even very primitive organisms, have this kind of sensory experience. But we have more than just sensations. We have a kind of content match. We see an apple and we think apple. And we see an apple and we think food. But sometimes we get things wrong. Maybe not quite so in such an extreme case as this, unless we're an artist. Sometimes we ask questions, so we don't quite know what the content should be. And then we have a gap in our content. Is this food? And sometimes we get things wrong in a dangerous way. So we think that we are dealing with food, and in fact, we're dealing with poison. So you see there are various dimensions of match, mismatch, completeness, gappiness, fulfilledness. And some people say that we can understand these dimensions in terms of language. So there is an important school, which I don't like, to which Dummett, for instance, belongs, which says that to understand experience, to understand intentionality, we need to understand semantics. So this is the primacy of language school. This says that the content is a matter of word meanings. And this can't be right because animals can have content. And in order to do justice to that, we need to understand something which is deeper than language, and that's what Brentano and Husserl are all about. For Brentano and Husserl and Chisholm and other followers of Brentano and Husserl, the dependence goes in the opposite direction. Meaning itself, language itself, is dependent upon a more fundamental psychological directedness. And the argument from this has to do with animals. So animals can be intentionally directed, but they don't have language. And babies can be intentionally directed. They can have beliefs about the world, and they can have emotional experiences about the world based on those beliefs without having language yet. So, and this again is the evolutionarily most basic case. So the baby already has the evolutionary foundations of psychological directedness, but the baby doesn't yet have language. Language, rather, is a secondary parasitic case. It's not closely geared to what is evolutionarily important. And what that means is that language allows intentionality to go on holiday. This is an expression from Wittgenstein. Language allows us to do bad things. For instance, it allows us to wallow in the pleasure derived from thinking about what does not exist, which for sure is art. Now, Meinong was the master of holiday intentionality. Intentionality about the non-existent. He wanted to create a general theory of aboutness which is not marked by what he called the prejudice in favour of the actual. Now, I am thoroughly imbued with the prejudice in favour of the actual. I don't think it's a prejudice at all, but Meinong thought that there was something. This is Bertrand Russell's copy of Meinong's book, Investigations on the Theory of Objects and Psychology. The theory of objects for Meinong includes not just actual existing objects, but also many different varieties of non-existent objects, forming what some people like to call Meinong's jungle. So there are objects which have being, which are real objects and ideal objects. So a real object is a donut. An ideal object is a state of affairs or an objective. That my donut is on the table, or that 2 + 2 = 4. Then there are objects that do not have being, including objects that have non-being, including non-contradictory objects such as a mountain made of donuts. That's not contradictory. There are no mountains made of donuts, but for Meinong there still is a mountain made of donuts. It's just not existent. There are contradictory objects such as the round square. And then there are objects not determined with respect to their being, such as the donut as such, which is neither existing nor non-existing, it's indeterminate. Some people might say that Meinong was crazy. It's a very interesting kind of craziness. However, it's not an ignorant craziness, it's a very subtle, it's a marvelous kind of craziness. So this is Bertrand Russell, who was a much more sensible kind of chap. It is argued by Meinong that we can speak about the golden mountain, the round square, and so on. In such theories, it seems to me, there is a failure of that feeling for reality which ought to be preserved even in the most abstract studies. Logic must no more admit a unicorn than zoology can. That's the end of Pavlov. And now, having said all of that, I'm going to talk about contemporary biomedical medicine. He's still here.
I'm still here.
In the olden days, biology worked with data like this. So you would look down your microscope and you would see a cell divide. And now, biology uses data like this. So this is a gene sequence fragment. And the problem is, how do you work with data like this? And the data comes from doing genomic or metagenomic analysis of DNA. And nowadays, we do genomic analysis of organisms such as humans and mice and flies, but also of shoes or dollar bills. Dollar bills are covered in bacteria. Very unhealthy. Or the inside of aeroplanes, or the corner down there in this room. How do you do biology when the data that comes back from such analysis looks like this? Now, that's a long story, but the problem is to link this kind of data with an image, for instance, or this kind of data with a phenotype which has been observed by biologists in the wild. How do you link this to this, or this? The answer, in part, it's a very complicated story, is to create an ontology. Many ontologies. Ontologies of disease, ontologies of mating behavior, ontologies of animal types, ontologies of cells, ontologies of cell parts, ontologies of molecules. And an ontology is a classification of the entities in the corresponding domain using terms which are accepted by all the people working in that domain, in principle at least. And now there are hundreds of biomedical ontologies, some of them good, some of them less good, but they are being built and they're being improved upon constantly by thousands of people. And the idea is that you have many different kinds of biological and chemical and medical data, and you use the same ontology terms to annotate many different databases, many different journal articles, many different experiments. And then, because you've used the same terms to annotate all this data, the data becomes networked together, and the data becomes discoverable. And then, if your ontology terms are defined using logical definitions, you can analyze the data through those logical definitions using the ontologies, and thereby do a kind of virtual research using the computer. Now, this turns out to be a very powerful instrument. And now there is a quite recognized method for doing medical research virtually using ontologies. So, how do we classify this, or this, or this? Well, we want to classify them using the same terms, because we want to relate this to this. This is one kind of data. This is another kind of data. It may be that this man wrote a novel, and that would be another kind of data. And the answer is, we build the emotion ontology. So the emotion ontology, which you can find at this address here, there are not 49,078 ontologies at this website. This website is created by the National Center for Biomedical Ontology, which has 3 US partners. One is Stanford University Medical School, one is the Mayo Clinic, and one is the Department of Philosophy in Buffalo. There are some hundreds of ontologies there, not all of which I recommend by any means. The emotion ontology consists of terms like feeling tired, feeling good, feeling weak, all of which are subtypes of subjective emotional feeling, which are in turn subtypes of what we call an affective representation. And it also contains terms like breathing at a slower rate, breathing at a more rapid rate, muscles becoming tense, muscles relaxing, and so on, blushing, all of which are physiological phenomena which are associated with specific kinds of emotions. And then we have emotion processes, such as, well, all of these are children of the higher level classificatory term emotion process: jealousy, hate, stress, despair, guilt, pleasure, pride, happiness, disgust, grief, love, fear, anxiety, shame, embarrassment, and so on. This is not rocket science, but it's useful. And it has to be done carefully. And there is a skill involved which is not unrelated to what philosophers do when they do what they used to call ontology or metaphysics. Now, what can you do with the emotion ontology? We have many data about chemical expression of emotions. So people analyze the chemistry of dopamine, for instance. And dopamine has a certain biological role. The CHEBI is the chemistry ontology. Each of the terms in these ontologies has a unique ID. So term number 25375 in the chemistry ontology is the general term molecular entity. A specific subtype of molecular entity is dopamine. Dopamine has the role neurotransmitter. The role is a realizable entity. It's realized in the process called neurotransmitter receptor activity, which is a term in the gene ontology, which is the most successful and the first of all of these big biomedical ontologies. And neurotransmitter receptor activity, we know, is a part of that emotion which is called happiness. So this is a piece of biology expressed in terms of 3 ontologies: the emotion ontology, the gene ontology, and the chemistry ontology. The The gene ontology is not an ontology of genes, it's an ontology of biological processes, molecular functions, and cellular components, which is used to annotate gene sequences. And I think I just have one more slide. We also want to use the emotion ontology for studying mental disease. So then there is now a journal called, believe it or not, the Journal of Biomedical Semantics, which is basically an ontology journal. And we published a paper called Foundations for a Realist Ontology of Mental Disease. And the idea is that there are diseases such as schizophrenia and depression which involve distinctive emotional components. And we want to use the emotion ontology in such a way as to help classify mental diseases and also the chemistry and the neurology associated with mental diseases. And this is just one example of the kind of ontology work which we think can be practically useful to extra philosophical domains like medicine. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions?
So there is a Otto Neurath. His example, there's an example that talking about unified science, he says that we can never tell in advance what causes what and where are the regularities, where is the explanation. So, and his favorite example was of meteopaths. So that weather influences on people moods. So he used that point as in favor of coherentism or holism against foundationalism. So his morals would be here that there is no privileged level of causation, explanation, or something, that anything can, in principle, can cause whatever. So whether psychological states, behavioral states, microorganisms, neurotoxins, whatever. So that in principle there is no problem about it, and that there is no need for classification, ontological classification, since it doesn't matter anyway.
So I agree with everything you said until the last sentence. So we're living in a world of big data. There are huge amounts of data which are growing exponentially all the time. In medicine, in biology, and in many other areas. Now, would you agree, forget Neurath for the moment, would you agree that medicine is making progress in its research? Okay. I think that we should try and bring it about that medicine continues to make progress. And if medicine is going to continue to make progress, then medicine needs to be able to handle, use, analyze, investigate, correlate, compare big data. Say yes.
Yes.
Now, I think that one important tool for analyzing and comparing and discovering relevant big data is ontology. There is an important job of finding ways to classify things in such a way that we can associate the classificatory information with big data so that we can find big data which is about the things we want to find data about. For instance, hearts and lungs and so on. And that's what ontology is for. It's an indispensable instrument for the future of medicine. And for the future of many other kinds of science too.
Can I just add?
That was easy.
Can I just add on that kind of part? Maybe your slide about happiness was actually kind of reductionist schema of things. I mean, just dopamine as such isn't what the happiness is all about. So there are many layers which can be introduced. So what is the satisfactory level of schema that would actually...
So, I say in part here. So it's clear that happiness can be affected or influenced in part also by reading novels or by falling in love. So there's no reductionist claims being made here at all. This is part of a much bigger and richer story. We want to use the emotion ontology to annotate literature, to annotate biographies, to annotate people's experiences when listening to lectures. In fact, that's one concrete practical application which it's already been used for. We got people in a conference, all of whom had laptops in front of them, to annotate each talk using terms from the emotion ontology. And then we analyzed the results, which we have to keep secret because otherwise people would be embarrassed. But it was an interesting experiment. So there is nothing reductionist here. I'm not a reductionist. And the one core formal ontology dimension in this work is Mariology, the theory of parts and wholes. And the nice thing about Mariology is that you can make Mariological assertions between small things and bigger things, and between bigger things and even bigger things, and you never have to say what the smallest things are, because you can work just in the middle. And you never have to say what the biggest things are.
I like it.
That was easy.
First of all, it's really fascinating to see from Husserl to search in Google to find out how to do things. This ontology, what are the methodology? Because moving from KV to M4M, KV, I think chemistry will tell us what is the ontology there. But when we move to emotion, what kind of constraints we have as philosophers? What you were mentioning mental illnesses, you know better than me, the kind of huge debates. Do we need an ontology that is theoretically neutral, so we can all talk to each other, but probably wrong? Or we have to go down with their own theories, they have their own ontology, but then we cannot talk to each other. So it seems in certain domains, maybe I can think that there is a kind of agreement about the current status of the basic ontology of a discipline. But when we move towards emotions, what kind of constraints do we have there to build up an ontology that has some kind of heuristic?
So building the chemistry ontology was not easy. It's still a work in progress. All big ontologies will always be a work in progress. The emotion ontology is relatively young, since 2 years old. We put it forward. Much of it is almost certainly already pretty stable because there is quite a lot of research about basic emotions. There are 6 basic emotions which are universal, so every culture has these 6 basic emotions. Other parts are still potentially capable of being modified. The whole structure may be modified in some ways. But if we don't put forward a first version of the emotional ontology, we'll never reach the point where we can create something which is really stable and able to serve as a consensus instrument. And there is a certain element of arbitrariness here. So let me see whether I want to hold on to that statement. No, I'll delete that. So there is a certain element of tentativeness. We put forward a version of the emotional ontology, and then people can criticize. People already have criticized it. We haven't made any radical changes yet, but we have made some adjustments. And we don't regard it as being a priori in a sense. It's an empirical proposal. Even the gene ontology is still being worked on, although it's now 16 years old, which is several epochs in bioinformatics.
Oh,
6 emotions, but then people are
6 basic emotions.
people are to agree what is an emotion. I really think that the whole old style philosophy.
When you said that, you just giggled.
No, I think
So you weren't happy.
Yes, still,
So you know what an
I made such an intelligent point. No, but I wanted to say, it seems that there is the philosophical work. It's not in saying what the expert will agree on. The real problem is what they mean when they say emotion. Still, it seems, so the methodology here is slightly different because it's more restrictive than just building a tool that the expert would find, would be confident or comfortable using.
Okay, good. So I'm not doing philosophy. I don't care that I'm not doing philosophy. I'm a free man. But I agree with you that different people mean different things when they use the word emotion, for instance. And if we're going to create consensus vocabularies for classifying phenomena which can serve the purposes of integrating research data, then we need to find a way of overcoming such divergences. And for that, we need arguments. Why we need to classify in this way rather than that way. We need empirical evidence, but we also need arguments. I think some of those arguments can come from philosophy. I think that the role I play in part in the biomedical ontology community is I have a loud voice, and I know philosophical arguments that the other people don't know because they never studied logic. So when I first started working with the gene ontology, they had definitions of the terms of the gene ontology, some of which were embarrassingly circular. So my favorite example is hemolysis was defined as the causes of hemolysis. That's not a good definition. And they saw that it was not a good definition as soon as I showed it to them and made them think. So that, to that degree, there is a philosophical component. It's kind of undergraduate logic.
Please.
I was just wondering very basically, within your approach regarding this whole emotional ontology, do you make a distinction or maybe take it as a special case, the problem that is sometimes called the problem of fictional emotions? Even in your response before you said you can be happy because I don't know you're happy in love or because you really do not. But for many people, emotion or fictional emotions are particularly problematic, and then it all depends on whether you accept Mine and Russell and their distinctive ideas about fictional characters. So do you think that here we need two ontologies, or will the same ontology cover both cases?
So I have slides about this. I agree, it's a very interesting question. But rather than waste time looking for the slides, I'll try and answer. So, start with pain. There is the evolutionarily most basic kind of pain when I hit the nenad in the jaw. Then there is phantom limb pain, and there is pain which does not correspond to any kind of tissue damage. So you have pain, it's a real pain, but there's no... You think you have a pain here in your jaw, but there's nothing wrong with your jaw, it's all in your brain. And this is damage to the nociceptive machinery of the brain. It's not damaged where you think it is. So that is the evolutionary non-basic case. We have pain because it's useful to have pain for survival. But once we have the machinery to experience pain, we can then experience pain in non-useful ways. Now, it's the same with perception. So we can have hallucinations, we can have phantom perceptions. Now, it's the same with emotions. We can have real emotions, the evolutionarily most basic sort, positive emotions. But we can also have emotions which involve going on holiday when we read fiction. Now, So we have a pain ontology in which we classify pains according to how they differ from the evolutionarily most basic cases. They're all part of the same ontology. Similarly, in the emotional ontology, we can have happiness, and then we can have sub-cases of happiness, which would include real happiness, and then sloppy happiness, the kind of happiness that you get from reading a cartoon in the newspaper.
Without the charge of being irrational, because many people say this is just irrational.
Plato said it was irrational and bad. So I don't think it's irrational at all. I think that there is a perfectly rational or a perfectly good reason for having fake happiness. Happiness. If you're an adolescent, you read novels in order to learn how to be happy in certain kinds of situations that you then can exploit when you're an adult.
But I have a problem with your type of explanation actually, and this category of fiction, emotional. I mean, do you understand when I say shame?
Yeah.
But how do you understand it? I mean, by relating to some feeling, isn't it? Or do you have some content that's unrelated to your emotional
So
content?
I understand shame, I hope, in just the same way that you understand shame. You understand it in terms of the kinds of contexts where shame can arise, in terms of descriptions of shame in novels, and in terms of actual experiences of shame, which are all bundled together.
So is it a fictional thing or not?
Shame is a real thing.
Yeah. So when you experience now, when you understand it now, do you experience this shame or not?
No, but
So
I know
is
what's
it fictional or not?
I don't think that it even arises. If you say, supposing that you read about shame in a novel by Tolstoy, then it's fictional shame that you would be reading about. If you ask me about shame in general, then it's shame.
I think when you have a word for the emotions, you have to understand by your emotions, by your experience. So the thing about the understanding emotion is not a thing of the world, but actually some kind of experience which is non-categorizable.
Okay,
And
so
then
I
you have
think
a word which actually categorizes and makes an ontological thing out of it.
yeah. So I think
So
that
this is
you are missing Brentano's point about intentionality. So I am now going to tell you about Pittsburgh. You are now thinking about Pittsburgh.
But
You don't have to do any work to think about Pittsburgh.
That's-
You just need
Yeah.
Pittsburgh in your mind.
Okay.
Now I'm going to talk about shame. And similarly, you don't need to do any work. You can think about shame very cheaply. It's very easy. If you want to think in more detail, then it gets more difficult. But just thinking about shame is easy. You don't need to imagine the shame.
But can the computer also think about
No.
Pittsburgh?
No,
No?
certainly not. Computers can't think. That's stupid.
Or have intentionality.
No.
But what's then aboutness of the...
So this is a whole new topic,
Yeah.
you realise.
I mean, I understand that
We can talk for hours
the
about this
question
question.
of qualia is actually quite important in this sense, in that you cannot actually extrapolate qualia of feeling into some third-person perspective.
That's another whole new topic.
I mean, I know, but you're...
So, what am I going to say? No, I need to wrap this up.
Maybe we can link it with
Yeah.
the previous suggestion. I'll be rather naive and go back to Aristotle and his qualifications, and put back this ontology thing. And when thinking of Aristotle, think about representation, mimesis, and representation of feelings. What is the best imprint of our feelings? Well, it's the question of body. How we are going to represent, say, what is it? The representation of shame. Well, the representation of shame can be that we blush in a moment when we feel that we think of shame. What the shame is, well, the first representation might be the sweating, or once again, we do have something as a feeling, and we do have representation of feeling, and we may think of feeling of shame in a certain way, as you said about Brentano, intentionally. What if those things happen without intention?
So, I hesitate to call blushing as a representation of anything. So blushing is a physiological phenomenon.
It is.
But I would be happy to accept that blushing often goes hand in hand with, or is even a part of, an experience of shame. And sweating.
Because you need to
And
classify
in
all
fact, that's
these
the
things.
kind of thing that the emotional ontology allows us to say. I don't think that I need to say anything else. So, am I missing something? Or you were just trying to throw light on what your colleague was saying?
Yes, because what we were missing in that representational part was the answer of the body
Yes.
answers.
Okay, so when we talk about shame, we are talking about something which has both experiential, introspectable elements and bodily
trace
elements.
in our body.
I agree with that. But that doesn't mean that when we talk about shame, we are aware of all of those things. We can talk about shame much more abstractly if we want. For instance, we can say there are 73 descriptions of shame in War and Peace. That's a perfectly sensible claim, and you could understand that claim without knowing about blush.
Actually, no.
Yes,
That's what I'm saying. You cannot actually know what the shame is unless you have been exposed to some shameful situation.
I will-
You feel shame, so you actually
Okay,
cannot.
I will propose a compromise. I will propose a handshake. You can understand that claim in part without understanding about blushing.
Which is subjective.
No, it's a perfectly objective understanding. Supposing you know that shame often involves sweating, but you don't know that
Or
shame often
shivering,
involves
or-
blushing. You only know a bit about shame, so you're shameless. You know that the word shame has a meaning, it means an emotion which is bad, and you are a student of literature, shameless student of literature, and you read that shame is described 73 times in War and Peace. You know something, you understand something. You don't understand everything about shame, but who does? We all understand only part of what shame is. But that's good enough. And it's certainly good enough for ontology work.
Yeah, but then what would a psychotic person who has no idea what shame can be, and not only feel shame, but then has no conception of what.
So you just made a description which I understood. A perfectly good description. We don't need to understand everything.
But we need to deal with that person.
Absolutely, and that's what
And
we're
how
trying
we
to
are
help.
going to deal with such a person.
So you're not going to deal with it better by worrying over the quality of shame.
Uh-huh.
He and I are not going to communicate better or worse by worrying. We have the same qualia when we understand the word shame.
Actually, I agree with you partly, but
Okay, good. So now that one was not so easy, but still.
So, can you give some examples? What would be the typical cases, strong examples of cases where ontological analysis is relevant for actual scientific practice?
So the gene ontology has been used to annotate millions and millions of data entries in databases and thousands of journal articles describing different kinds of diseases and different kinds of organisms. Now, there are many journal articles talking about cancer. And there are people called biocurators whose job is to read those articles and annotate references to genes or proteins or other kinds of data using gene ontology terms. All of this data is in the gene ontology annotation database. And it turns out to be a statistically very useful tool to infer the average expression of different genes in different tissues, in different organisms. Okay, so you now have a resource which tells you what the typical gene expression in a colon for a male human might be. So that data is there. So now a medical researcher takes 634 colon cancer patients and he takes biopsies of their colons and he does a DNA analysis of the biopsies of their colons and he gets certain gene expression patterns for each gene. And using the gene ontology database, he knows what the normal expression should be. So he can see which genes, you can see it on the screen, which genes are overexpressed in cancer patients and which genes are underexpressed in cancer patients. And then he can go to those genes and he can try and find out which drugs might counteract whatever it is which is causing the overexpression or the underexpression. Now that method is perfectly standard for any kind of tissue. And you can see how it can be generalized.
Okay, does it mean that any kind of taxonomy is doing ontology?
So in order to get that kind of statistical data through the gene ontology, you need to use the gene ontology hierarchy. So that's a taxonomy. It's a very, very complicated 30,000 term taxonomy. Not every taxonomy has been used to annotate thousands and thousands of journal articles very carefully by biologists with PhDs who could get paid to do that. The gene ontology has been used for that purpose, and so you have a very rich data source. Now, some taxonomies could be used for that purpose, but most taxonomies couldn't. They're just not useful.
What is, according to you, the ontological status of, let's say, happiness? You say shame is real. What kind of entity is that?
Happiness?
Or shame, or any kind of...
Well, you can look in the emotion ontology what happiness is.
No, I mean just the ontological status. Is it...
Yeah, I'm checking.
Yeah.
So, I suppose I can just search. Well, let's see. Happiness, it's an emotion process. I know what that means. It's a kind of mental process, which is a kind of process. A process is an occurrence. It's something that has temporal parts which unfolds itself in time. So if you have happiness, then you have the first 5 minutes of your happiness, the next 5 minutes of your happiness, and so on. Happiness is a mental process. Actually, which we classify, and this may be a controversial move, we classify mental processes as subtypes of physiological processes, and we classify physiological processes as subtypes of physical processes. So a mental process is a kind of physical process. Some people wouldn't like that, but we think that is defensible.
So you say the kind of function of a person in time and place, something like that?
Yes. So you can't have happiness without a person. You can't have happiness, and you can't have a person without a person being in some place. But happiness is always temporally localized. It's always within a certain region of time. And there'll be vagueness problems where it begins and where it ends. You can't be happy when you're asleep. This is in the current sense of happiness. We also have happiness as a disposition. So some people are generally happier than other people. But they are not always happy. They're only happy when their disposition to happiness is realized in a happiness process.
And you don't think that this the thing called happiness that is common to all those tokens happiness?
Absolutely, yeah. It's called happiness. Happiness is what is common. The happiness type, which is what the ontology represents, is what is common to all the happiness tokens.
And what is the ontological status of this happiness type? Does it exist as an abstract?
So I believe so this is from the ontological point of view, not this is the second time I have to say this. It's not an interesting question. From the philosophical point of view, I am embarrassed to admit that it is an Aristotelian. So Aristotle defended moderate realism. In other words, the universal becomes a part of the instance. So along those lines, but I feel nervous talking like that. Take it back.
Okay, last question.
Just one last. How do you define the difference between fear and anxiety on your ontological?
So I need to check. I don't have an internet connection. But that if you go to so this came from the Bible. If you go to this link here and enter the word happiness, the word anxiety, you'll see a definition. And then you enter the word fear, you'll see another definition. So every term is defined. We did
Do you have some kind of distinctive features that
So yes, we have. First of all, the definition will always give you the genus. So this is the species, this is the genus, and then it will give you the differentiator, which distinguishes, for instance, feeling alert from feeling